She thought humiliating him would be the highlight of her day. But what happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. It was a typical night in one of the city's most upscale restaurants, where elegance dripped from every corner, and the air buzzed with quiet chatter and clinking glasses. Marcus, a young black waiter, moved between tables with practiced ease, balancing plates and polite smiles. For him, this job was a means to an end, a stepping stone toward his dreams. But tonight, the weight of condescension hung heavier than usual. The diners, wrapped in their privilege, barely noticed him beyond their needs. Marcus had learned to brush off the dismissive snaps and half-hearted thanks. Had mastered the art of invisibility. But beneath his calm exterior, a quiet determination simmered, sparked every time his eyes flicked to the grand piano in the corner. Music was his sanctuary, a world far removed from the judgment and expectations he faced daily. Yet tonight, that sanctuary felt miles away. Little did Marcus know, a storm was brewing, a storm that would challenge his patience, test his strength, and reveal a talent no one in the room saw coming. As Marcus carried plates to the table, he noticed her walk in, a wealthy white woman, elegantly dressed, but with an air of entitlement that filled the room before she even spoke. She was the kind of guest everyone secretly hoped wouldn't end up in their section, and tonight, Marcus wasn't so lucky. From the moment she sat down, her presence was commanding, but not in a way that inspired respect. Instead, it was the kind of dominance born from privilege, the kind that demanded attention simply because it could. She started with the small but cutting comments. "Is this the best you can do?" she asked, frowning at a perfectly plated dish as though it had personally offended her. Marcus, staying calm as always, apologized politely and replaced her meal without hesitation. But her remarks didn't stop there. As the evening went on, her tone became sharper, each word dripping with condescension. She'd glance at him dismissively, snapping her fingers when she needed something, as though he existed solely to serve her whims. It wasn't enough to order him around. She wanted to make a spectacle. Her voice, just loud enough for surrounding tables to hear, carried mockery thinly veiled as curiosity. "You must have dreams beyond this place," she said, feigning interest. Marcus nodded politely, refusing to let her comments sink in, but her next move caught him off guard. She noticed his fleeting glances toward the grand piano in the corner, a glance he thought no one else would pick up on. "Oh, you keep looking at that piano," she said, her lips curling into a smirk. "You play, don't you?" Marcus paused, unsure how to respond. The room went quiet, diners subtly turning their attention to the exchange. She leaned forward, her voice laced with mockery. "Come on, show us what you can do. Or is that just for decoration?" The challenge was clear, and it wasn't meant as a compliment. She wasn't curious. She wanted to embarrass him, to remind him of his place. Marcus could feel the weight of every eye in the room. He knew what was expected. A polite decline, a quiet retreat. But something in him shifted. Her words stung, but they also sparked something deeper. After a long pause, Marcus finally met her gaze. Without a word, he walked toward the piano, his steps measured and deliberate. The air was thick with anticipation, and the woman leaned back in her chair, clearly expecting a show. What she didn't know was that she was about to witness something she'd never forget. Marcus approached the piano, his steps steady despite the pounding in his chest. The room seemed to shrink as every eye in the restaurant turned to him, their collective gaze a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and quiet disbelief. The woman leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, a smug grin tugging at her lips. She had created this spectacle, and she was clearly expecting to enjoy the outcome. Sitting down, Marcus ran his fingers lightly across the keys, testing their weight. His mind raced with a flood of emotions, anger at being forced into this moment, fear of failing under pressure, and a spark of determination that had carried him through so many challenges before. He drew a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment to block out the stares and mocking smiles. The first note rang out, soft but clear, like a drop of water in stillness. Then another, and another. As his hands moved, the music began to take shape, a hauntingly beautiful melody that poured out of him, raw and unrestrained. It wasn't just music, it was a story. Every note carried the weight of his experiences, his struggles, his triumphs. The restaurant, once filled with chatter and clinking silverware, was now utterly silent. The patrons, who moments ago had barely noticed Marcus, were transfixed. Some exchanged glances, their faces shifting from skepticism to awe. Even the woman, who had initiated the humiliation, seemed caught off guard. Her smirk wavered, replaced by a look of disbelief as the power dynamic she had so confidently controlled began to shift. Marcus' playing grew more intense, each note building on the last. The melody swelled, filling the room with an energy that seemed to hold everyone in place. This wasn't just talent, it was passion, the kind that left no space for indifference. By the time the final chord faded into silence, the air in the room felt heavier, charged with the weight of what had just happened. Marcus lifted his hands from the keys, his head held high. The challenge she had thrown at him had backfired in a way no one could have expected, and for the first time that night, the stares directed at Marcus weren't filled with judgment, they were filled with respect. As Marcus' fingers moved across the piano keys, the music surged into something powerful and undeniable. Each note resonated with raw emotion, filling the room with a melody that seemed to pour straight from his soul. It was the kind of performance that couldn't be ignored, the kind that demanded to be felt. The once noisy restaurant was now completely silent, the clinking of silverware and hushed conversations replaced by the pure sound of Marcus' music. The patrons sat frozen, their meals forgotten, their gazes locked on the young man they had barely noticed minutes ago. Even those who had initially smirked or looked skeptical were transfixed, their expressions shifting to awe. The piece grew more complex, the rhythm faster, the intensity building with every passing second. Marcus wasn't just playing the piano, he was telling a story of struggle and resilience, of hope and defiance. It wasn't just a performance, it was a declaration. Every chord and every melody challenged the assumptions and judgments that had been placed on him that evening. The woman who had pushed him into this moment sat motionless, her smirk long gone. Her arms, once crossed in smug satisfaction, were now resting limply on the table. She stared at Marcus, her expression unreadable but clearly shaken. The power she thought she wielded over him was slipping away, replaced by the realization that she had miscalculated in the worst possible way. As the music reached its crescendo, the air in the room seemed to vibrate. It wasn't just the beauty of the music that captivated the audience. It was the sheer force of Marcus' presence, the way he poured himself into every note. He wasn't just playing the piano, he was reclaiming his dignity in a way that words could never achieve. The final note rang out, holding for a moment before fading into silence. The room remained still, as though no one dared to break the spell Marcus had cast. And then, slowly at first, but quickly building, the applause began. It started with one table, then another, until the entire room erupted in cheers and claps. Some patrons stood, giving Marcus a standing ovation, their faces alight with admiration. For a moment, the line between server and guest, between judged and judge, blurred completely. Marcus turned slightly from the piano, his eyes meeting those of the woman who had challenged him. She looked away, her face red with embarrassment. Marcus didn't need to say a word. He had spoken through his music, and the message was clear. He was far more than they had assumed, far more than she had ever intended him to be. In that moment, he was the most important person in the room. The applause filled the restaurant, echoing off the high ceilings and spilling out into the night. Marcus remained seated at the piano for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the keys, his heart pounding. He had felt the shift in the room, an energy he hadn't expected, an overwhelming mix of disbelief, admiration, and respect. Slowly, he stood, his posture straight and his head held high, and turned to face the crowd. The diners clapped and cheered, some still on their feet. A few of them even nodded in approval, offering smiles that felt genuine for the first time that night. One woman near the front wiped a tear from her cheek, visibly moved by what she'd just heard. Marcus gave a polite nod of acknowledgement, a small but powerful gesture that conveyed his gratitude without diminishing his quiet pride. The woman who had orchestrated the entire scene, however, sat frozen at her table. She was no longer smug, no longer commanding the room with her presence. Her carefully crafted image of superiority had been shattered, and now she looked uncomfortable in her own skin. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, her face flushed with embarrassment. For the first time that evening, she was the one who seemed small. Marcus returned to his duties, walking back toward the kitchen. The clapping slowly subsided, replaced by the buzz of hushed conversations as the diners began to process what they had just witnessed. Even the staff, who had been observing from the sidelines, looked at Marcus with newfound admiration. A busboy gave him a thumbs up as he passed, and one of the servers whispered, "That was incredible," as he walked by. Before Marcus could slip away, a man in a sharp suit approached him. He was one of the diners who had been seated near the back of the room, quietly observing everything. He extended a business card to Marcus, his expression serious but kind. "I've been in the music industry for a long time," the man said. "What you just did, that's not something you see every day. Call me, we need to talk." Marcus took the card, his hand steady despite the surge of excitement rushing through him. He glanced at the man, nodded again, and tucked the card into his pocket without a word. He didn't need to speak. The night had already said everything for him. As Marcus moved through the rest of his shift, the air around him felt different. Diners who had ignored him earlier now smiled as he passed. One couple even stopped him to say, "That was beautiful," before he could refill their water glasses. Even though he knew the impact of this moment might not change everything, it had changed something. The woman who had set it all in motion finally rose from her seat, leaving behind a half-finished meal. She walked out quietly, her head down, avoiding Marcus' gaze as she exited the restaurant. For her, the night had been a lesson, though whether she would take it to heart was a question Marcus didn't dwell on. By the time the night ended, Marcus left the restaurant with more than just his pride intact. He carried with him a newfound confidence, a reminder of his worth, and perhaps even the beginning of a new opportunity. He glanced at the card in his pocket one more time before heading home, a small smile on his face. The piano had always been his voice, and tonight it had spoken louder than words ever could. As the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, Marcus moved through his remaining tasks with a quiet confidence. The energy in the room had shifted, where there was once dismissal and indifference, there was now respect. Diners nodded at him as he passed, some offering genuine smiles or quiet compliments. The applause may have faded, but its impact lingered. The business card in his pocket felt like a new chapter waiting to be written. The man who had given it to him, a seasoned music producer, had recognized something in Marcus that no one else in the room had expected. It wasn't just his talent, it was his ability to move people, to transform an ordinary evening into something extraordinary. As Marcus finished his shift and prepared to leave, he noticed the woman who had challenged him slipping out of the restaurant. Her earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost sheepish demeanor. She avoided his gaze, walking briskly to the exit. For a moment, Marcus thought of saying something, but he decided against it. She had already heard everything she needed to. When Marcus stepped outside into the crisp night air, he felt lighter. The evening had started with humiliation, but ended with triumph. As he walked home, he glanced at the card again, his smile widening. He knew this was just the beginning, an opportunity to turn his passion into something more. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. True worth isn't determined by status, wealth, or prejudice. It's revealed through resilience and the courage to rise above judgment. Marcus' story reminds us that underestimating others says more about our own character than theirs. Every small action, whether cruel or kind, has the power to change lives. Choose humility and respect. You never know whose brilliance you might witness. Subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. Please note this is not a real story. It's a work of fiction only for education and entertainment purposes.